Hi, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.3 demo for the piece I call Miss Kanzuki. So continuing the theme of me pulling out some older pieces and putting some color with them, you can see here jumping in. This is a sketch I did of Kanzuki from Street Fighter. This is in her alpha costume because I did this drawing originally before Street Fighter V was even a thing. Street Fighter 4 was still going strong when I did the original drawing, so her outfit is not updated. It is her old one. And I just always liked it. The funny thing is I always liked it, and I particularly liked her face, but then once I pulled it up to color it, I wanted to redo it. So there was just something that wasn't working as well as I wanted it to. So you can see here I'm resketching it a couple of times, trying to get it the way that I want it. I originally sketched it over the old head, and there was something not working with it, and I was like, okay, let's just get away from it entirely and do a new face off to the side. And then we can bring that in and see how it works with the painting. So you can see there I'm also just double checking some of the anatomy. That's why you saw me quickly pencil in her torso, just to say like, okay, is that arm in the right spot? Is everything still working? Because I technically shrunk her face now to give her different proportions, and I liked the way that looked, but I just wanted to make sure everything else still worked with that. So now we have a little bit of redrawing that we have to do to reconcile everything for the paint. We have to just first of all finish off these details in the face so I can make sure that they're the way I want them. And then the new ear has to be situated differently, because once you start adjusting the facial features, assuming that you're still keeping all of your general relative proportions the same, you have to adjust things like the ear. So that was all done with the original drawing that was just an old Instagram photo that I had, and then the redraw was done with the fat pencil, which I have linked below. And when Procreate 5 comes out, I'm going to have a new video that shows how to do basically some of these old tricks that have been tried and true that I've been using here on my channel. I'm going to show the way that they're done now in Procreate 5. So right now though, we are still in the land of Procreate 4.3, and those videos are not going to get updated yet, though you can kind of figure them out for yourself. And by those videos, I'm specifically referring to the fat pencil video and the select paint, select clear video. So select paint, select clear is a technique I use when I'm using a unified shadow layer, and by unified shadow layer I mean one shadow layer that sits on top of all of the flats. Ultimately I do use more than one shadow layer, but what I mean is instead of having sort of like a shadow layer for the skin and then a different shadow layer for the clothes, I'm using one shadow layer on top of everything that then affects every layer below it. So what we're doing right now is the main flatting process, where I'm going to go through and paint in on separate layers all of the main components that are the same base color. So for her, we're going to have the skin color is the same across everywhere. There is skin variation, but we do that with additional layers to do things like maybe darkening around the eyes or some blush around the nose and ears and fingers, that type of stuff. But we're going to go through and do all of the major chunks. So for this character, we do have the face and ear separate from the rest of her skin. So we've got the face and ear on a layer, then we have the rest of her skin on a layer, and then not necessarily in this particular order, we're going to have all of the red from her outfit on a layer. The gloves are in two pieces because she has a brown component and a dark blue component. We're going to have both of those as different layers. We're going to have her hair split up into a couple. The main bulk of it is going to be what's pulled back tight on the back of her head, and then her big curls. Then she's going to have her bangs as two separate layers as well. Her bow is going to be a layer, and then she's got these sort of like bicycle shorts underneath her skirt. That's a layer. And that, I think, more or less covers everything. There is also some white pinstriping that is in her costume, and that's going to be a separate layer, although it ultimately doesn't have to be. It just was because this was a pretty low layer file, so I didn't have to worry about getting those layers back, kind of thing. Now you're going to notice in this, we've got this orange, almost like wall behind her, and then this blob of kind of white, bluish white up in the top left. That's because I originally had an intent for this image to be at night, That's why the background is also really dark. As it goes on, I start not feeling that and I want to take it somewhere else, and you'll see that when we get there. I was considering putting her at the Kanzuki Estate, which is a level that appears in Street Fighter V. I don't think it appears in Alpha. I think it's just 5 and like the mobile puzzle fighter game. But anyways, the point is that's originally what the lighting was going to be, this sort of warm lighting behind her, and then this mostly white but kind of cool lighting above her, kind of like moon and interior, but I didn't really like it. At some point you'll see me, I think it's in this version of the file, I'll bring in a screenshot from the game for a second just to see if it feels good having that like in the background, and it kind of didn't, and I decided to take it just in a more graphic, cleaner kind of way. But for now it doesn't matter actually, because we're flatting. And once we get into the lighting passes, there's a number of ways that we can do that. And we can even have the light coming from the same directions that it's coming from, but since there's all these like blend modes on these layers, we can just adjust all of those layers to compensate for the lighting. As long as the lighting doesn't change its layout, we're fine. So that lighting from behind her could change from pink to blue to green, and her shadows can change accordingly, and the bounce light can change accordingly, as long as we don't actually put, say, that blotch in the top left below her and to the right kind of thing. So in the final piece, she'll still be lit this way, but it'll be with different palette and a different environment around her, more or less. So right now you can see the way those flats are working. We've got all of those curls and that curl that comes in front of her ear, and then the sort of top side of the back bang. So the part of the bang that goes up before it comes back down. And now we're throwing in the fore bang, the foreground bang, her bang. God, can bangs be singular? Anyways, that big ass chunk of hair that is closest to us is the part that we're painting in now. And then we'll paint in the version that is the furthest from us next, and that'll go underneath that sort of up arc that was part of the main body of her hair. Right there. And that's just to keep everything separate, because we really want those lines to be clean when we're doing the shadow work later, and it's easier if it's all on different layers to make sure that it's clean. Sometimes there's some deliberate messiness that will come in later if something looks a little too sterile, but I'd kind of rather have things be too clean and then bring some messiness to it later than be trying to clean things up all the time. Something that really irritates me as an artist, which is one of the reasons why my process is the way that it is the idea of having something really, really messy, and then you kind of go in later and refine. It's just not in my nature, and it drives me kind of nuts. It feels really tedious, so I don't have that as a particular part of my process. There have been times where I've done like an entire piece deliberately kind of messy, and then let's say it's like the character's face or some other focal point, I'll render it up like a little bit more cleanly, but I don't like it as a general process for an entire thing. So I always try to err on the side of clean and then bring in some natural messiness or hand paintedness later. Here we're just bringing the eye into realization. She has brown eyes, by the way. I always try to make sure when I'm doing art of existing characters that I get some of those details accurately. One thing that I thought would be fun to address as almost like a companion ramble, I guess, to the last video where I was talking about fan art and doing fan art and all that kind of stuff. Something that I should have also mentioned that I think is really important is, at the end of the day, if you're doing art, you're hopefully doing it because you like it. And if you're looking for reasons to get better, a lot of it is about your motivation and just being excited about what you're working on. And I think that if drawing existing characters is what gets you excited, because if you're like me, as I described, like, I didn't get into art exactly because it was just like I just started drawing from absolutely no influence. I was seeing things like cartoons and other things that I really wanted to draw, so I drew them. So if you're like me and it was that type of a thing that inspired you to start drawing in the first place, then why not be motivated and continue to be motivated by that kind of thing if the end result is that you're doing art and you're even finding opportunities to learn new things while you're doing that. I think that it's important to always be trying to draw different things as much as you can, but if it comes down to, oh, I'm forcing myself to draw something that I have no interest in, or drawing something that you're super excited about and it really gets you, it gives you the energy to do it, then you should do that. So I think one of the reasons why you see me going through these old pieces, aside from the fact that it's nice because I don't have to create anything brand new from scratch, I just have to do the painting part, is these are also characters and things that I just really love. I've always loved Capcom, especially 90s Capcom and early 2000s, well, maybe not early 2000s, but you know, basically the heyday of like the Mega Mans and all the beat 'em ups and the fighting games and just that like crazy cool stuff. Mega Man Legends I've always thought was like a really cool world, so that type of stuff always really inspired me. So if I can dig up some art that I've got laying around of that, like why not, right? It's just really exciting to me, and I feel like there's less of it these days, so it's really fun to go back to these characters with their strong color blocking and their really fun shapes and stuff. So the summary of this video's ramble is, it's always good to draw different things, but if it comes down to not drawing, or drawing something that you just love and you're worried because it's just a thing you love and people are like, oh, don't do fan art, whatever, like just do it, because at least then you're drawing and you're having fun and you're doing cool stuff, and do your best to try and make some learning happen in there, and you're good to go. I mean, I would argue that anytime you're drawing anything, you're learning whether you want to or not. It's just about trying to maximize that learning a little bit. So I'm gonna bow out for the rest of this flatting process because it's just flatting, and you guys have heard me ramble on about that a lot. And then I'll come in when we start talking about interesting stuff. So, bye. Now the ambient occlusion has begun. Now I was kind of having, I'll admit, I was having a little bit of an identity crisis with the lighting in this one, even though I knew I wanted to set it up this way, and then of course later change it, but at the time I thought I wanted to set it up this way. I was dealing with some bit of a blue but really desaturated shadow. I wanted to try something where the shadows were really desaturated in general. As much as I love like an orangey key light with really blue purple shadows, I kind of have moved away from that over the last, I don't know, let's call it year, just because I've been finding interesting looks in different ways, and I've been wanting to continue to explore that. So I wanted to see if I could do this sort of nighttime scene without having to get into that trap. And by the way, it's just a trap for me. It's totally fine, and you'll see me do that also from time to time. But I just was trying to go for something a little bit different, and it really made the piece kind of dull. And I knew that was going to kind of happen. Sometimes ambient occlusion passes are very dull deliberately because you're trying to capture this like dark recesses of the figure, but it just wasn't exactly doing what I wanted to. So you're going to see the shadows in this get redefined a few different ways, especially because the lighting gets redefined. And I just wanted to call it out here because you see it going in right now, and it's pretty like muddy kind of, and that does change, but I don't think that it was necessarily wrong, and I definitely would have made whatever adjustments I needed to fix that, but it just wasn't exciting for me. It wasn't exactly what I was looking for, so we eventually move away from that. you'll see me drop the opacity on her dress. That's because I have her shoulder as a separate layer in order to make sure I could capture that separation there, similar to the way that I did the hair, and I couldn't really determine where the shoulder clothing ended and her main dress began. So I did that just so that I could see the difference. Very simple, just lowering the opacity, because I didn't have to really worry about knowing what values I'm working with because I'm using a unified shadow layer. So it just works once the opacity is turned back up again. Eventually, even though I love this like rich red dress, I do slightly drop its saturation a bit because I thought it was just keying really high, and I want to just take some of the intensity off of it a bit, but it's still a bright red dress. It's just a little less like high chroma. Now we are entering the most intensive part of this illustration, which is her hair. Even in the drawing, it was her hair. It's that thing where painting something that's big and let's say big and smooth is the easiest thing to paint, because you're just trying to capture that smoothness, but it's one big shape. And painting lots of tiny little shapes is where it's hard. You just have like 1,000 times the geometry than you would with something that was bigger. So getting in here and doing all of these curls and trying to make sure that we've got somewhat accurate lighting in there is certainly a pain. So that's what we're doing here, and I would assume that like 50% of this video is just doing this ambient occlusion pass here, but I'll just sort of let it roll, and you can watch me fumble through getting this as accurate as I can. Okay, so we're wrapping up the ambient occlusion pass. Her shoulder and the skin of her arm and her foreground hand, that and those glove pieces are actually the topmost layers of the entire illustration. So now that that's all done, you can see me quickly throwing in a shadow and being like, is this going to be good? And so that was me just testing out the shadow. Now you can see it's got a bit of a blue to it, but it is very desaturated and very dark, and that's because, again, I was trying to make sure I was hitting that and getting some of the right color theory going, but without it being too overly saturated. A character that's lit from the back is, in my opinion, kind of like really easy and fun to paint, because it's just like these giant blocks of shadow, and then you can go back in with some bounce light and define the face, and that's just kind of fun to me. But the color scheme of this lighting is ultimately not going to work, and so at this point I don't know that I'm not going to like doing that. I'm still, experimenting and just seeing how far it goes, since I'm using this method of painting where there's the blend layers and all that stuff. Then I know that I can always change it later. So right now I'm just trying to get it going and see if it's going to work, and I'll take that as far as I can before I decide to change it. The critical moment is before I start doing bounce light, because the bounce light is just sampled. I'm just like color picking and then painting in and adjusting opacities basically. So right now we're working on that skin that is the undermost layer. Now we've moved to the face, which is the next layer up, and then as we go we'll just try to block in this lighting as good as we can, and then eventually you're going to see all of this shift around and become new lighting entirely. So I'll come back when that happens and talk through it. end of the shadow layer, and you'll also see me, now that I've got all this defined, I'll throw in like her fingernails and get those done. Those will be down by the base skin layer. That's like a white layer that's been lowered, of the whole nail is white with a lowered opacity, and then depending on the character and what's going on, so you can see it going in right there, I'll then put one more layer that's kind of like the part of the nail at the end of the nail where it's not touching skin, and I'll try to capture some of that detail in there. But it depends, I won't always do that. I just did a painting with a girl who has essentially like French tips, and that I tried to emphasize that a little bit more in that piece. That was kind of a funny moment right there if you rewind a bit, where I had painted her back bow wrong. I like misread my flat and thought that I was all fine with it, and here I'm making my adjustments so that I can get that properly represented. We're actually looking into the whole of that like bow that's turned, and I'm also having to do this direct shadow on the bow, because these are just things that for whatever reason I missed them when I was going through my layers. So a bit of a slip up, but easily recoverable by creating a couple of new layers, or a new layer, doing the multiply and combining it with the ones that already exist, which is what just happened there. It was a big combination. Now that I've got the shadow layers on, what you just saw was me boosting a little bit the blush and the lip layers, so we can get those to come through a little bit more. And now we're doing that bounce layer from that light, so you can see on her hand and now on her arm where we're throwing in some of that bounce light. And as I've mentioned before, this is nice because it's something that exists in real life, but it doesn't exist 100% of the time in real life, so we try to always make sure that we bring it in for stylistic reasons. And it also really helps us flesh out the rest of the shape by having the lighting on the one side and then the softer bounce lighting on the other side. It also takes our direct shadow and sort of converts it into a core shadow, and that is like a good way to tell the human brain what's happening with the form. We're just giving more information about that form, because our brain processes form based on how light's hitting it. And so we've got like that one light coming from that way and then that other light coming from that way. And so then when we look at like her arm right there, for instance, we start really filling in what those shapes look like in all directions, just based on what little information we have there. And now we're doing the same on the face, and we're going to move through essentially anything that we think will get a good reflection off of that bounce light. So not everything, but anything that is normally getting those types of bounces and has that kind of reflectivity. That's what we're going to focus on. Some crazy stuff where I'm going to put a yellow overlay over all the highlights so that I can start making that highlight side a little bit more intense, and then we're also going to bloom out that side of the illustration. So let's watch it, and then I'll do a really quick demo of it. So here's my shadow layer, or my light layer coming in. Here's me going through a couple of different layer settings to see if I can get exactly the look that I'm going for, and of course adjusting the opacities and everything. And then we're going to select all of that and create the bloom layer for it, which is happening right there. And then we'll adjust that opacity and layer settings. Now we're going to quickly do the saturated haloing that happens around the shadow. And we're going to stylize it by just straight up like painting it in and then lowering its opacity. And when this phase is over, I'll do a really quick demo for you guys on what I did with the lighting there basically. Okay, let's try to do this quickly because I think that it's really simplistic in thinking, but sometimes when you have like a big cumbersome piece, it can be really hard to see how it could be done. So we're going to try and simulate this very quickly here. I'm going to just use hard airbrush just to make everything as simple as possible. So I think one of the main ways that this works really nicely, of course, is to get just a darker scene just so that we can really see the effects of it right now. Obviously bloom can happen not just in a dark scene, but it just really helps. I've just got a couple of layers here. We'll just start by creating a circle that's like this. Fill it, and then let's just actually select that and we'll fill here. That way I don't have to use two hands. Okay, sure, that color is fine. Fill, and we'll just do this. That's a little simplistic, so we'll do one more and we'll color shift that to, sure, that's fine. And then let's make you even smaller and put you like here, something like that. That seems fine. Okay, now this is going to be really crude, so do not judge me based on this. Let's go with something like that. So the way that we do everything, of course, with this is with the select paint, select clear, right? So I'm going to quickly simulate a shitty version of what I already do with everything that you've seen. So we're gonna do like something like this, just cause, sure. Ooh, it's so good. And then select. Actually, we don't need to clear the blue. So let's just do that. Oop, I always do that. That's something you don't see when you're watching the time lapse. Okay, so sure, that, and then select clear. Select, and then, okay, do it again, right? Let me quickly select. Actually, I kind of fucked one thing up. So let's copy, undo the merge, paste, and then we'll do select inverse and clear that. There we go. That way it's not as messy. Now we're going to also do one more layer that's set to multiply. That's going to just be cast shadows. Let's just call it that for now, right? So we'll do, just to keep it simple, we will do a select and then a fill and then a select and then a fill, and then we'll just move this like that. Okay, and then select clear, select clear, and select inverse. Okay, so there's a cleaner way that I could have done all of that, but I'm one-handed while I'm holding the microphone right now, so this is just kind of an easier way to do it. Also, this lighting sucks, but it's a nice way to just sort of show what these particular tricks are that I'm about to show you. And it's essentially the same trick, but just kind of thought about in different ways. So let's create a new layer. And it's actually good that we had to create this sort of master shape because we're going to need that right now. We're going to select it, and now we're going to go to our new layer, and you can see up in the top left. Actually, we're sorry, we're not gonna go to that. We don't have to go to that. Since I already have the combine, I'm just I'm barely thinking straight right now. I apologize. Okay, so let's go with what we had before, which is the slightly yellowy light. That's what we've got in the actual piece. And we're just going to fill it right here. Okay, so we basically have this shape that you see right here, but it's here as a whole. Now we're just going to take the shadow layers. So let's combine those. Select, and then clear. So right now we've cleared away all the yellow from the shadows. Now we can take this layer and we can say, let's say like color, right? Which just will make the color change. Saturation, hue, you can find what you want. We're gonna go with overlay. And so you can see here the effects that it has on there. So let's just go with full brightness and make it as intense as possible. The other trick for the bloom is you select your highlights, which right now, because of the way that we did this, we have this nice layer here, this layer 7, that has all of the highlights on them. And you're going to come over here to the wrench and you're going to say copy canvas. So what that does is it copies everything in the selection, all layers. So when we paste it onto a new layer right here, paste, let's turn off all these layers, you can see we have that. Why is that important? Because we're going to blur it. Let's do like pretty significant just so that we can really show the effect here. Let's turn these layers back on. And then we'll take the shadow layer and we'll select it, and then we'll select the inverse of that so that we can get rid of all the extra bullshit. Clear. And then we can adjust this now, and you can see how it's blooming into the shadows there. Actually, you know what, the way that I cleared that just now isn't necessarily what you want to do. Like if you actually have this dark environment, you'd want the bloom to exceed the shape as well. So it just depends on what you're going for. You can either have that cleaned up or not. It kind of depends. But anyways, the point is you can adjust this. And so let's put it to something like that. And so when we toggle it, you can see the big difference between that and that as far as really selling how intense that lighting actually is and that reflection. You'd still want to go in and put some effort into, of course, like if I jump in here real quick, I'd sample maybe that color and then select the blue and then do like just a little bit of this. And on the yellow, maybe I would sample that just to get some sort of a bounce on there. Select and do, oops, there I go, doing it again. There we go, something like that. And that might give you some of that extra bounce that you're looking for to really sell those shapes. And so now we'll start moving through some bounce light in the actual piece. Similar to what I just did with the spheres there, I'm looking for reflective surfaces and surfaces that are bright and trying to find the right spots to sort of have that interplay happen between them. Now, this process can sometimes be a little random and I'm a little all over the place, so I encourage you to look through and see in this part what I'm doing when, because it's going to be really hard to talk through it. I know that I've got like some red bounce from the hair and some of the hair affecting itself. Her sleeve that's closest to us is getting some reflection. The underside of the glove that's closest to us is getting some of the dress reflection. So it's kind of happening all over, and trying to find where it pops up is like a mini game unto itself. Now we're of course doing her hair shine, and we'll try to go through her hair and just hit every spot where that makes the most sense to be doing it. Now this next part's exciting because you get to see how completely lost I was with the background here. You can see I'm changing the color here now, and then I'm also adding in this sort of painterly effect. I'm thinking to myself, okay, I usually do sort of like a lighter color and a darker color. What if I do like two completely different colors, and I've got some of this one color kind of bleeding through, and I'm trying to just find where I want to go with this. I no longer want to do that background that I said before. I want this to be stylistic. I've sort of lit her like it's nighttime. Let's continue to do that. And that's where my head is at this point. As you saw at the beginning of this video, the piece ends up very bright overall. So there's sort of a weird and twisting path as to how we get there. So right now, I've done something where I've increased the bloom around her, and I'm trying to put a stylistic bloom by having it masked with the turpentine brush and just try to find like an interesting play there. I believe that actually exists in the final piece too, but it's much more subdued because it's not against like a black background. So here I'm thinking to myself, okay, what can I do maybe with like something a little bit more pop arty? There I am throwing in that background just to see if it's going to work for me, and I'm not feeling it. So now we start getting some purple into the mix, which is actually close to where her palette, not her environment, but her palette goes later, is she has this bit of a purple tint to it. But as you can see, it's still really dark in the background. Part of the reason why it was dark is because I was thinking originally night, but I was also thinking, hey, that's something that people don't see from me, is like this really dark background with the character. But you know, sometimes just because it's something you don't normally do doesn't mean it's the right answer for the piece. So doing something with a dark background might be something I do later, but I have to be aware of like when it's the right time, and it wasn't really working for this piece. So here I just started messing with other things that I could be doing with the graphic design kind of around her, and just trying to kind of find what's the interesting thing with this character. As I've mentioned in some other videos, I have a Guile piece that's laying around that kind of suffered from the same identity crisis where I just don't really know what to do with him. And so with this is me saying like, okay, I'm not going to let this happen to this character. I put more work into this character than I did into the Guile. Let's try and salvage it. So really this is an experimentation thing. Some artists will have a plan for their piece. Some artists will have a plan for one piece and not for others, but a lot of the times there are parts that are plans and parts that aren't, and sometimes you just have to find it, and that's totally normal. So at this point, I can't say that I have like an end goal aside from I'm not happy with this, how do I get happy with this? And you can already see now that her shadows are starting to saturate more because I'm changing those shadows. Her bounce light is saturated more. So now I'm thinking to myself, well, I've got this turquoise and pink outline. Maybe I should bring turquoise and pink into her, and that's where these shadow changes happen. And so as I'm doing this though, I have to make sure that I'm not getting wrapped up in the treatment, and that I'm also still representing the character, because you know, you could do Corinne in like a Cyberpunk 2077, is that what that game's called? Anyways, that type of a look, and it would be cool looking, but you'd be like, why is this character done this way? And I feel like that's kind of the territory we're in right now with her, is that she's got these like 80s neon colors to her, but that's not necessarily something that's associated with her. Now if you wanted to do like a reimagining of her in the 80s, you would also want to change a lot of her costumes, so this isn't really working out. I'm usually not a fan of blowing up the character and putting them in the background, but I thought maybe that would work for this, so I thought I'd give it a shot and try it out. And so it stuck around for a little bit, but then I was just like, this is stupid. Like, why are we seeing her face twice? It's not like an actual anime or something where they're trying to represent like her inner thoughts or something like that. This is just a still image of her. And so I'm saying to myself at this point, like, okay, you are just doing completely random stuff. You don't really know where you want to take this. So stop and do a couple of the other details that you hadn't gotten to yet. So like putting the shine on her gloves and a few other little things. So this is me just sort of continuing to work the actual part of it that needs to get finished while I'm sort of wallowing in the current state of it, and then I can see what's working and what's not. And so I end up like throwing a curveball at the whole thing and just going bright with it. And in a second, we're going to start seeing the brightness come in, and then we're going to have me considering different versions as well. This piece is also one of those pieces that I showed to my wife at one point and said like, this one or this one, and then she was like, neither. And it's like, okay, this one or this one. Yeah, okay, that one's better. And so that's where we're going now. We're starting to see me change these colors, that pink is getting a little bit away from magenta and becoming a little more peach. I'm also reducing it a lot more so that it's more hinted at than it's actually like this big fat outline. So trying to find maybe a hint or a slightly more elegant way to be doing that. And the same thing is going to happen on the turquoise side of it as well. And we're going to just start trying to explore different colors. So I already pulled out that light creamy yellow, and that's still in the back of my mind while I'm doing this. And we're going to try, okay, well, what happens if we take that like ghosted image and do it with the yellow? Is that something that looks good? And it's coming right now. And it didn't look good. And then I was like, well, I've got this white field, let's just work with that. So I start doing like a cast shadow of her, which is just used by duplicating her entire shape as black, but then I don't want it to just be like a computer copy. So we go in and we actually do some painting work on it to try and make it a little bit more natural looking. And now I'm like thinking, you know, she's still too dark, but this environment is much better. This feels more like something that's going to be interesting to look at, and it highlights her and her silhouette a lot better. So let's just go with something like that. So now we're going to start adjusting these shadow layers so that they are getting warmer because she's in a warmer environment, and so that they get less intense, and then we can start seeing what that means. There you just saw her outline also turn from pink and turquoise to like orange and yellow. So now we're into this sort of mental state of adjusting the palette. And that's really what all of this is here at the end. That last bit flew by really quickly, but this here is the finished piece. You can see that once I decided to go with this background, not only did my brain like it better so it was easier to reconcile, I just had to quickly go through and reconcile the outline colors and make sure her shadows felt like they were more in the world. And then just as like a little bit of a unifying thing, there actually is a slight purple color tint across the entire image just to kind of unify it and give it a little bit of a subtle depth to it. So this piece was kind of rescued from the pits of almost not being finished, but I was really happy with the way it came out. I like the character a lot, even though I don't regularly play her, and it was just really fun to bring this old drawing out and give it some color. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I will see you on the next one. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.